Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled The Long Game, Helping Owners Win Beyond Construction. This presentation is sponsored by Innate. My name is Harry Coons, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. Please note that throughout the presentation, all microphones will be muted to minimize any background noise or feedback that may distract the presenters. We will be using the Q&A function for questions. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A function found in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. We will gather all questions throughout the webinar and have time at the end of the presentation for the speaker to address those questions. We will be recording today's webinar. Today's presenters are Lily Sanders and AJ Waters. Lily Sanders is the Director of Product and Industry Solutions at Innate. In this role, she leads an agile team of product managers and solution engineers who are identifying and solving our customers' biggest challenges across some of the most complex industries. Lily is responsible for defining and delivering product vision for the safety, quality, and commissioning and virtual design, construction, product lines within Innate. Lily holds a bachelor's degree. AJ Waters is the Vice President of Industry Solutions for Innate. He leads a team of engineers who work with customers to develop solutions that help solve their greatest project challenges while increasing their profitability and agility. AJ helps drive digital transformation in the industry by bringing together innovation, technology, and data. AJ holds a master's degree in structural engineering from the University of Nebraska and a bachelor's degree in mathematics and physics from Doane University. Welcome, Lily and AJ.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure to be here. Lily, welcome as well.
Harry. Thank you.
Well, again, good morning or good afternoon to all of you, wherever you are at today. We plan to walk through essentially just the concepts of helping owners win on capital projects beyond construction. And we've titled this The Long Game, or that's kind of the phrase that you will hear throughout. And really, to set the stage before we dive into those topics, we want to talk about, like, what do we mean by this long game? What is that exactly? And one of the things that we've noticed in the industry, regardless if it's messaging from us here at Innate or from other providers, you'll hear the phrases like solutions for every project phase. And this is just an example of the diagram that we use to talk about that. But when they talk about every phase of a capital project, whether it's from pre-planning to design, construction to startup, or all the way through to operations, what often gets lost in these diagrams or these conversations is the fact that this diagram just frankly isn't to scale, especially when you're looking at these project phases from the concept of an owner. Because when you look at those first four phases, even from planning all the way through to startup, that is a very finite amount of time in the complete life cycle of your project. That dot 5, that operations, that dot could go on and last for years, if not decades, or maybe even centuries. And we'll look at just a few examples to set that up. First and foremost, one of the most recognizable structures here in the United States, the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge began construction in 1869, and that construction phase took 14 years. It was only a $15 million budget, so interesting to see, a mega project that was only $1 million per construction year, not $1 billion. But what's interesting about this, or where we start to look at the long game, is that this project has been operational now for 138 years, or almost 10 times. And I don't think they plan on tearing it down anytime soon. Now, in that operations phase, it went through some major renovations. So it saw construction type activities happen again. Well, why is all this important? Well, there were things that happened before construction in those first few phases that had a lasting impact on the fact that the bridge stands today. One of those monumental decisions was it was the first bridge of its kind to use bundling in the suspension cables. Now, at the time, this looked like a major delay to the construction project. It added months to the schedule when they decided to go this route. But that decision alone is one of the major reasons why the bridge has the longevity that it has today. And cable maintenance didn't need to take place until over 100 years later. Oh, and by the way, it was $150 million just to fix the cables. But it's not just these mega bridges that have this sort of experience, right? Another very recognizable structure in the world, the Sydney Opera House. The Sydney Opera House actually had a very similar construction phase to the bridge. It took 14 years. And a lot of people will take a look at that and go, well, I know it's a fancy looking building, but to take as long as the bridge was to construct, well, we'll talk about that here in a minute. But even the Sydney Opera House has well outlived its construction phase. It had one minor renovation in the 2000s to replace some wood paneling. But the reason that it took 14 years to build the Sydney Opera House is because they made an early planning decision that they wanted to start construction early. They wanted to get out in front of the design. They didn't have all the plans in place. They weren't sure how it was going to work out, but they were going to move forward. And that caused them to have to completely rebuild the main columns. And oh, by the way, the roof was going to be too expensive, and it had to go through 12 redesigns before they could get to a final decision on the project. So all of that turned into a 14-year construction schedule. But what's most interesting about all this is arguably the most recognizable part of this structure, the roof, went through 12 redesigns because their original plan was too expensive. So that's some of the things that we're looking at when we talk about the long game, where decisions up front or even throughout construction can make lasting impacts on the longevity or the impression of that particular asset. One more that's a little more recent, we'll look at the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa. The tallest building in the world took only 6 years to build. But even this relatively recent project has already doubled its construction lifespan. Now, it hasn't had a major renovation yet, but one of the reasons that it was built so quickly was its design. The tubular design led to needing half the amount of steel that the Empire State Building has. That decision in the early planning phases led to a shortened finite schedule up front. But there was also a decision that needed to be made that was had a major impact on the operations and maintenance of this facility. And that's cleaning the windows of the world's tallest building. That window cleaning system required its own design, and it takes 36 workers 3 to 4 months a year to do. At the top, they even put together an unmanned piece of equipment to do it, so it needed its own new technology. And so that one decision in the pre-planning phase led to its own design, led to a different way to operate and maintain the facility. What do all these projects have in common? Why are we using these to set the stage? Well, first and foremost, at the time of construction, many of these were considered among the world's largest and most complex projects. And because of that, they had innovative new designs and extensive teams of collaborators and contributors, all trying to get to a plan that would allow them to execute with hundreds and thousands of workers. Now, everything that they did up front, all these decisions that they made, even with that, they mostly still had significant overruns in costs or scheduled delays. But most importantly, in terms of the long game, they have all outlived their construction duration. And that .5 has well eclipsed what it took to put together the product itself. So our goal today is to walk through how understanding the bigger picture and how putting together a connected data story through dots 1 through 4 or through the planning and construction phases of a project can make a big difference long term for capital projects owners. And so what we're going to start with is just looking at the bigger picture and planning, how setting yourself up right from the beginning can have an impact. What that means then for construction, how it plays into operation and maintenance. And then, oh, by the way, when it comes to large capital projects owners, typically there's more than one project. So we're going to look at how the connected data story, specifically around your planning, execution, and maintenance phases of a capital project asset and getting those aligned through operations, commissioning, and turnover, can get you to the right place to have the most impactful story long term. To kick it off, we'll dive in with the planning phase, where the dream of a project intersects with the reality of some of the ways we have to build these things. And really, it's all about putting together the best plan. The famous quote, if you plan to fail, or if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail, Benjamin Franklin. Well, back when we were talking about the bridge, could you imagine trying to build something to the scale of the Brooklyn Bridge with parchment paper and a drafting pencil? Today, those large designs on the mega projects that we're used to require several firms partnering together, each taking their own piece of the puzzle. And when you do that, it requires collaboration that is not necessarily possible with a piece of paper.
That's exactly right, AJ. And what we tend to see in the more successful projects is that they've often gone through the planning and design stages of their projects with the startup and commissioning, turnover deliverables, dates, responsibilities, clearly laid out and in a central location for all stakeholders early in the decision-making process. This availability of the information early in the planning stage really helps reduce the churn that we tend to see at a point in the project that's usually most critical, that final stretch where your dates are already slipping and you may have had some personnel changes and you're trying to make up as much of your time as possible. Additionally, collaborating effectively and having a central place for your project documents, all of the asset and system metadata, and true real-time progress of where you are in your project. Housing all of that information in a single source of truth helps reduce the time spent processing and responding to RFIs, and often actually reduces the total number of RFIs on a project.
And it's not just about the documentation, because if we remember what we heard about the Sydney Opera House, it wasn't just the plan itself, but it was understanding what the plan would cost. That led to 12 redesigns over a 6-year period. Now, think of what you could have done with those 6 years in the construction phase on a 14-year project. So taking those plan sets and making a full definition of not just the scope, but the cost and the schedule in one place allows you to begin what we consider the delicate balancing act of the three as the project evolves. So having scope, cost, and schedule all together in one single source of truth, you're not just able to have the plan set up front, You're not just able to know the costs, but you begin to truly understand and quantify the risks. Because poor risk mitigation is a leading cause for scope erosion during construction. And what does erosion of scope mean? It means at the end of the day, a lower quality or less functional asset for you, the owner. And so a construction risk assessment will help to guard against not just overly optimistic schedules, but guard against cost and schedules not aligning to one another. Putting all of these items together, the plan or the scope, the cost, and the schedule can get you to a better path for delivery.
As we try and craft that path to delivery and make sure we've got the most effective plan in place, building and centralizing your digital commissioning and delivery plan really helps ensure that path is going to be successful and achievable and generally efficient. This is also one of the first ways you'll tend to know if your turnover dates can or can't be met for that project. Creating an execution plan that integrates construction, quality, startup, and commissioning activities, those construction checklists, startup tests, and is flexible enough to support the evolving project requirements will help make those plans resilient as scope changes or members of your project team change, and you're forced to review and revise your path to completion. An integrative progressive plan that's always being reviewed and is responsive to change in the field prevents these teams from losing critical information during handover and promotes efficient execution well before turnover, which really supports those teams in their successful path to delivery.
And as much as we want to say that plans make perfect, right? In the construction phase, you can't win them all. And sometimes plans may change a bit from what we expected or hoped to encounter. Probably one of the most famous parts of construction or buildings that has a blunder, if you will, is the Leaning Tower of Pisa. But what most people don't realize is that this began to start sinking on construction of the second floor. In fact, if you look really close, it looks almost like the top floor is straight. That's because as the building sank, they started to build one wall taller than the other to try to compensate. Now, that's probably not the best mitigation strategy for a sinking building, but could you imagine what maybe could have happened if they had full access to not just the plan, but the geotechnical report and how they were going to move forward before trying to just build taller walls? Another pretty famous bridge in construction lore, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. This bridge actually started to oscillate during construction. In fact, while the bridge was still under construction, they hired 2 engineering firms to study the oscillation and come back with a recommendation for how to get it to stop. We'll talk more about what happened with that later, but most of you probably know. If you're on the East Coast, you might recognize the John Hancock Tower. The John Hancock Tower actually began construction with an innovative new blue glazing system that they thought would be the next step in glass building construction. However, as construction progressed up, the building began to lose windows. Not only did it begin to lose windows, but the police were so afraid if the winds of Boston got higher than 40 miles per hour, they would shut down a 3-block radius around this structure. And then lastly, the Harmon Hotel in Las Vegas. If you haven't heard of the Harmon Hotel in Las Vegas, don't worry. It's because it no longer exists. During construction, it was discovered that improper rebar installation led to an under-reinforced foundation. The first thing they tried to do to solve for this particular plan is they cut 20 floors off the top of the building. Just one problem. A second study came back after the building topped out that said that wasn't enough. And very quickly, the Harmon Hotel became the most expensive billboard in Las Vegas history. What does this all mean? It means that those best laid plans often go awry, or in plain English, change is inevitable. And you've got to understand the trade-off. Having that connected data story across the entire project lifecycle allows you to begin that delicate balancing act of scope, cost, and schedule throughout the execution phase of the construction. And as you do that, not just make adjustments to a plan or to a drawing, but to the entire story. Dictating complete control over any one of these, though, means that the others will fall in jeopardy. If you go back to the example of the Opera House, dictating complete control of the cost of the structure meant that the schedule was going to slip 6 years while you tried to fix the scope to align with the cost. And so having all that information connected into one solution where the cost from one area can lead into the RFI of another and then ultimately into the punch list items will allow you to maintain compliance throughout.
And that whole change is inevitable concept, really the revising of the plan and making sure it's accurately reflecting what's going on in the construction phase is critical as we try to maintain compliance with the owner's project requirements. No matter how big or small your project is, if we're talking a $5 million parking structure or a $5 billion new airport, you know, the 10 systems of a parking structure versus the 1,000 systems of an airport, managing those requirements throughout construction and commissioning is challenging regardless of the size. It's easier to prove you've met your contractual requirements with a digital inventory of your construction check sheets, your quality inspections, those completed test results, your certificates of completion, especially if you can take all of that really valuable information and link it directly to the key assets and systems in your facility. The linked data repository can really help make sure you're meeting those standards while driving the most effective path to completion. Depending on your facility, it can be critical for the owner and for your warranty period to verify and monitor that those key pieces of equipment have been properly maintained and throughout the entire construction process. The best way to do that, of course, is with a connected care and maintenance program, which really helps make handover to operations as seamless as possible and enables the owner and the operators to transition into that operations phase from day one without any information gaps or information loss during that transition.
And all of that information in a single place will lead you to making the most informed decision for your project to step forward when that change happens. Because as we like to say here at Innate, the answer doesn't necessarily lie in finding more technology. It lies in connecting technology so that all stakeholders can maximize the transparency and bridge the common gaps to get to a higher level of certainty. So when you come across an issue out in the field, you can notify those who need to hear about it, put together a workflow to get every stakeholder involved, count the costs, and ultimately close out the item as it gets commissioned in startup, while still being able to keep a complete picture of not just that one project, but all projects across the connected data mindset. But once construction is done, you do have to maintain that asset. And that's really where the fun begins, right? Because the asset means that it's likely creating revenue for capital project owners. But creating revenue, making decisions in the construction phase sometimes equals living with the consequences. The Leaning Tower of Pisa took 700 years to stabilize. But thankfully, in the last 10 years, it hasn't sunk. On the flip side, though, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge famously collapsed 5 days after those oscillation studies concluded. Had they just paused and waited for the studies to finish, and allowed for those changes to be integrated into the construction plan, maybe they wouldn't have had to rebuild the whole bridge. As for the John Hancock Tower, well, they kept going with their glazing system. They thought it would be the next step. But at the end of the day, all 10,344 windows had to be replaced in the facility. By the time they made that replacement, only 5,000 of them were from the original construction. So that meant more than half of the windows on this building fell out before they decided to make a change. And of course, we already mentioned the most expensive billboard in Las Vegas. Well, if you go to Las Vegas now, it is the most expensive patio in Las Vegas, as they took the building itself down, and that street that's running along the bottom side of this image, that's Las Vegas Boulevard. That is some real estate that cannot be used because of under reinforcement in that concrete slab. So when you end up living with the consequences, and maybe they won't all be this bad, but there comes a time where you have to realize this asset might need changed, upgraded, windows might need replaced, whatever it might be. And if we go back to our example of the Brooklyn Bridge, if you remember, the bridge was completed in the late 1800s, 1883. Cable maintenance kind of was ongoing throughout the life cycle, but shortly after the World War, they dropped the amount of workers that were dedicated to maintaining this structure. And that led to a 1974 plan to replace the cables. However, that plan was too expensive, so they put it on hold. And in 1981, 2 cables snapped, ultimately killing a pedestrian, and therefore accelerating the timetable to replace said cables. Now, hopefully it doesn't take a catastrophic event to realize it's time to do maintenance on your project, but the ongoing maintenance of an asset through service orders and small caps brings you right back around to the same balancing of scope, cost, and schedule that you saw in construction, and the need for going right back in and finding everything that you know about that asset and where it's at today, so that you can again make the most informed decision.
That's exactly correct, AJ. Again, with that most informed decision, the second point in time here, really by creating a digital twin as an owner operator or as a contractor trying to drive value to the owner, you can accurately represent the project's evolution from the planning and design stage to that closeout phase. Owners then have easy access to the asset and facility metadata, relevant documentation, and can see the historical information about how that asset was installed, constructed, tested, and maintained throughout the entire life cycle. As that asset is upgraded, that digital twin can be updated to continue providing up-to-date detailed data to the owners and operators, and to help those teams head off some of those catastrophes we just heard from you, AJ.
And that's where it really starts to become fun, because making these decisions for each one of these individual projects, when you're a capital projects owner or a manager of a large portfolio, each one of those decisions can have a lasting impact on what we consider the long game. Because where there's one project that is all the way through to operations, there's likely another project that's in some sort of construction phase, maybe approaching startup and turnover. And yet another project that is maybe halfway through construction, or even another project that's in the concept of pre-planning phase. Why is all this important? Because when you think of all these projects together in one program or portfolio, these projects are endlessly competing with one another over 2 things: finite budgets and finite resources. And so any decision that you make regarding one of these projects could have a lasting impact on the remainder, as that finite amount of budget or resources gets diminished. Because what's going to happen is there's going to be a ripple effect. The erosion of scope, cost, or schedule in one project makes its way through to other projects, and the whole concept of, well, do we take money from here now and make this project work? Or do we delay, have a lower quality asset, and pay for it later? That significant change in cost could diminish those funds for something else. But it's not just construction when it comes to overall program management, because that project could be relevant to a non-construction related program within your company. Let's say you're building a data center and you need to launch a major software upgrade. Until that data center is finished, that software upgrade might be on hold, or your customers may experience difficulty. That could be a large ripple effect, or even more so, it could get all the way to us, the consumer. If it's a pipeline that has a delay or is hacked and needs to be shut down, that result, that ripple effect as you try to maintain or turn that system back on, could hit us as the end users as well. And so this delicate balancing of scope, cost, and schedule, not just for one project, but for all of them, is what we call playing the long game.
A few key points about how to continue playing that long game, or start if you haven't, especially on the owner-operator side, is to really focus in on taking what you've learned in those construction phases of a project across your entire portfolio and standardizing the delivery of your turnover requirements, which is key to building out that informative metrics across your entire portfolio. Because for most owners, the moment the contractor walks off that site, their warranty period has expired. That's the last time that they have got that opportunity to get that data from the contractor, as most of us know. And that's when the real work starts to begin for the owners and the operators, the facility management group running that asset. A connected data message with solutions for every phase of the capital project lifecycle, again, from planning, design, through construction, startup, commissioning, and operations, is incredibly invaluable to the owner, especially when you can access all of that information in a digital inventory that's available to all stakeholders. Every decision that's been made, aggregated into that larger ongoing program, really helps the owner operator decide what they're going to do next. Where are they going to make those upgrades? What, is there recommissioning that's going to need to happen at what point in time in the asset's life cycle? And how are they going to build a plan to bring all of the data they brought in perhaps a new project throughout that commissioning phase into those later decisions of the asset's life cycle?
So with all that being said, hopefully throughout today's presentation, you've kind of understood and picked up on why having that connected data story can help to build that bigger picture when it comes to such a finite point in an asset's life cycle. Why having that connected data message in the planning phase allows you to find those best plans, mitigate those risks, and get those turnover items ready to go. So to Lily's point, when the schedule has its most critical points, you're not trying to find ways to fit them in. But at the same time, as you're in construction, change is inevitable. And the faster you can determine the trade-offs, the faster you can get to a decision that is informed and allows you to make changes, not just to the project, but to the cost, the schedule, and the operations. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have to live with those consequences. You want to be able to reference the decisions that you made so that you can manage and maintain that asset accordingly. And oh, by the way, every one of those decisions have a lasting impact on the greater overall story that you're trying to tell with your capital projects and with your programs. So with that, kind of that quick run through of how a connected data story can tie that bigger picture together, we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Lily and AJ. We'll now address some of those questions from the audience. Again, you guys can figure out who can answer it best. We have one question. What are some ways owners can leverage commissioning agents to help build insights about their assets and their facilities?
Happy to take that one, AJ. I think through the development of the owner's project requirements and those turnover requirements, really properly categorizing the equipment and assets in a format that owner can then leverage from project to project, whether on the same campus or across a different country even. The owners can really manage their care and maintenance programs while monitoring performance across a wide array of assets and asset classes and asset types and systems, if they've worked with that commissioning agent to establish that consistent formatting up front at the beginning of the project's life cycle.
Okay, thank you. How can teams keep their turnover plans in mind early in the planning and design?
So I'll take that one as well. Really commissioning agents should work directly with the owners to establish those owner project requirements, as we were just discussing, helping identify what the needs are for that facility. Is it a new facility? Is it existing building? Is there an occupancy requirement? Are there operational requirements that we need to consider as we're building out that plan? Once those OPRs or those owner project requirements are established, setting up your commissioning scope and in conjunction with the designers and builders to create a digital thread that can be reported on and managed from the very beginning of the project's life cycle, again, is really the key way to take all of those turnover requirements and deliverables and bring them into the earliest stages of the construction project.
Okay, thanks. Finally, what are some key benefits to the project teams and stakeholders by integrating construction quality and commissioning into a single execution plan?
My thoughts on that there, AJ, I think whether there's a single execution plan or we've got multiple plans managed with an oversight committee, the ability to use a single source of truth across each of those teams is really the key and where this kind of collaboration shines. Construction teams, creating and managing the fine details of their scope in a way that makes sense to them, that then the construction installation dance that they do can really feed right into the quality stages, and we can build our quality program around how construction is managing the entire process and take all of that information into commissioning. Again, really putting all that information into a single location that then can be morphed from each team without losing any data is really the key to that successful path.
And let's not forget also about the end goal, right? The concept of the digital twin, right? So integrating all of this together not only allows these stakeholders to work together during construction, but at the end of the day, it gives you that single source of truth that you can reference from now on, right? When we looked at the bridge itself, and trying to reference or peel through pages and pages of drawings to understand what happened and when, and what might have been sequenced in what order, and how that may have impacted where we are today, that difficulty diminishes greatly when you're working with that integrated plan that allows you to reference everything in a single location. It allows you to go back and see, on this day, we didn't just do X, Y, and Z, but we also did A, B, and C. And because of that, may have impacted something completely unrelated because they were both on site at the same time and got in the way of one another.
Okay, we did another question has popped up. With many user groups representing on NC projects, how can the design team, owner, architect, contractor ensure that the OPR and BOD are met?
I'm happy to start with that. NC, I assume here is the new construction projects. I believe with what we tend to see being most effective is constant review and bringing in each of the key managers or representatives from those different teams into those design review processes, into those plan review processes, and really making sure that as we're reviewing the owner's project requirements and translating those perhaps into the basis of design, we've got representatives for the owner in those conversations, driving those deliverables and laying them out for everybody to see at the beginning, right? What is that closeout checklist? What is that substantial completion? What are the requirements that we need to ensure we are then using to trickle down to each of those teams to make sure those requirements are met? Building in workflows and building in, gates more or less for us to actually mark each one of those requirements as complete across those different project groups is really an effective way for those teams and for the owner reps to make sure that they've got everything they need to satisfy those requirements.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, thanks again, Lily and AJ and Innate. We appreciate your time and your expertise. On behalf of the Building Commissioning Association, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's presentation, and I hope that you have a great day.
Thank you.